Hi, ADHD family. I'm Yakini coming to you from ADHD Love. Welcome to another episode of ADHD Love Parent Talk, where I bring on different guests and we talk about all things ADHD. My guests include parents. They may have ADHD or have children that have ADHD, doctors, therapists, educators, and so many more. So the idea is to bring you information, to put tools in your toolbox, and that way you can pull them out as you need to. So today I'm very excited to introduce my guest. It is Meghan, and please pronounce your last name. Is it O'Neill?
O'Neill, yeah.
Oh, perfect. Welcome, Meghan. I'm so excited to have you here.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm really excited.
Let's just take a step back. I want you to introduce yourself and, tell the audience a little bit about your practice, and then also talk about why do you know so much about ADHD?
Yeah. So I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and right now I have a private practice in East Tennessee, and I'm actually also licensed in California because I used to live there. So I can help people through video sessions if you're in California. But in my current private practice, I see people of all ages. I see kids as young as 3, and I've worked with people in their 80s. I help with kind of a variety of issues, but mostly it's grief, anxiety, depression, and developmental challenges like autism, ADHD, and other behavioral issues that parents might be having a hard time kind of getting a handle on.
Okay, perfect. So that leads into my next question. So one of the things that I will say probably it's been about 7 years now, I took my daughter to see a therapist, and she, talked to her, wrote some things down, and basically looked at me and says, I'm not sure if it is autism or ADHD, and then said, okay, you should look to see this particular psychologist. I see that also online where people are just not sure which one their child would fall under. So can you share the difference between autism and ADHD? When would they have one or the other? And then when would it actually be combined?
Yeah, so it is actually kind of tricky to separate them. When you kind of look at both diagnoses, like with a broad lens, we kind of see issues in a lot of similar areas. So there's executive functioning issues, there's emotional regulation, there's learning issues, sensory processing, social skills, independence, things like that. Both of them are neurological conditions. So there's quite a lot of overlap there. So it does make it hard to separate them out. I would say that the main difference is when you're looking at ADHD, the categories that the difficulties fall into are with concentration and impulsivity, kind of like the subtypes will tell you, right? Mm-hmm. With autism, what we're seeing a lot of is the main issues are in areas of communication. So that's like expressing and understanding communication, verbal and nonverbal. There's issues with cognition, so actually the process of thinking and understanding information. And there's issues with social skills, and that falls into, reading social cues, knowing how to make friends and things like that. If you're too close or far away from somebody, a lot of those social things. And there's often a lot of repetitive behaviors and kind of obsessive thinking or just repetitive movements that we see in autism that are a pretty clear sign of autism in itself. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So when they are diagnosed with both, why would they be? Why wouldn't they be separated in one or the other? Why would they have both?
Yeah, it's a great question, because if there are these differences, then it kind of maybe should be one or the other, right? But you can have some of the symptoms of both that if you're seeing some of the social deficits that might come up, that might fall more into an autism presentation. So if the social issues are in not understanding social cues, that would be where, that falls into that. But maybe the type of executive functioning issues they're having are more aligned with the ADHD types of issues in that realm. So you could have both, because the way that certain issues are presenting just sort of fit better in each of the categories, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So how do you treat ADHD versus autism? Like, how do you make sure you're handling or supporting the right diagnosis?
Yeah. So a lot of the reason for getting a diagnosis is so that the treatment is appropriate. So for both, luckily, behavior therapy is one of those things that works kind of across the board, because what you're looking at is dealing with skill deficits, skills that are lacking, that just need a little bit of bolstering, need more practice, need introduction. So there's a lot of skill building that goes in with behavior therapy. So luckily it actually works for both. So if you have both diagnoses, if you have one or the other, the treatment is actually really, really similar. But again, it would depend on sort of the child, the family, and the particular issues that are showing up, that maybe you would focus more on certain skills within behavior therapy. And with that, parent training is really big for both diagnoses. Within behavior therapy, involving the parents, getting their perspective on what's going on, and helping them manage some of the things that pop up, because our responses as adults to what a child is bringing can sort of keep a cycle going, or it can break a cycle. And so we also have to be aware of how we're interacting with each other. So that's where parent training is really, really important. Yeah.
Yeah, I really think that is important and very key, is the parent piece, right? So even for myself, that was one of the things that I said that I needed help with. So now I have, well, I'll say 2 ADHD children. Even though my daughter was recently diagnosed, I knew that whole time. So I had to treat certain situations differently, and I had to interact with them differently, because I wanted to make sure I had a different result, right? And so I needed to have that training and talk to people and say, okay, or the appropriate people, I will say, and say, okay, what are the things that I need to do to make sure that I'm interacting with my children better, right? And I think that is so key, because it starts with us. It really does. And people don't realize that, because they're going to be who they are, right? And they don't fit into a box like every other child. So it starts with me. So yeah, I think that parent training is so important.
Yeah, and I'll even add to that with the way that I work too with my ADHD kids is, and even my sort of more mild autism kiddos, the behavior therapy is great. And I also work in a lot of mindfulness, because I've noticed that that touches on a lot of the anxiety and depression that might come along with both of those diagnoses. And it also just really works on taking judgment out of these intense interactions, and things that are going on internally, and works on getting to know your system and your process just in a calmer way, and also getting in tune with your senses, which is really big because of all the sensory issues that go along with both autism and ADHD. So I found that mindfulness has been a really nice addition to behavior therapy, at least in the way that I kind of incorporated them. So yeah.
Very nice, very nice. So now a parent knows, whether it's ADHD or autism or both, now they know what their child is diagnosed with. So what are your, preliminary tips, and how did they get started in helping their child in the right direction? And we'll get into a little bit deeper on the therapy side, but outside of therapy, what else should they be doing? What is that first step for them?
Yeah, so outside of therapy, I would say that when you get a diagnosis, that can be a really big deal for a family. And I would say that even if you've kind of suspected, like you were saying with your daughter, that like you kind of knew, but there just wasn't a label to it.
Right.
That when you get that official diagnosis, that name for what's going on, that can bring up a lot of emotion. And I've seen a lot of families go through a mix of emotions. So sometimes there's relief. I think a lot of times there's relief that, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
what our family has been going through, what my child has been going through. There's a name for this, which means we can do something to help, right? So there's relief. But I would also say there's a lot of other stuff that goes on that really looks like a grief process to me. So it's a change, right? Getting a diagnosis changes things for a family. And so that might be really scary. You might have feelings of anger that maybe a diagnosis was missed for so long, or, you've gone through so much already that, there's just frustrations that have been built up. I've seen some families who are honestly like even a little bit numb to the process, that like there's a name now, but I don't really know how to feel about that. So sometimes that comes up. So I would say before kind of going into therapy and all of that stuff, just sitting with that process of getting that label, and again, with sort of the non-judgment kind of idea, just go through that. Like there's nothing wrong with having a mix of feelings that come up. So sit with that, and whatever your reaction is, to just be honest with that and go with it. And then move into, what do I need to do, right? So I would say kind of that first part is just welcome all the feelings and thoughts that come with that. Go through that. If you have a partner, go through it with them. If you have a support network, go through that with them. Go through it by yourself. Just get in touch with all that stuff. And then after that, if you're the type of person who wants lots of information, go get all that information, right? Like there's tons of info out there. So get informed. And then when you're informed, you can take, some of the next steps and with that new knowledge. So that's kind of that part of it.
Okay, very cool. So one of the things I wanted to talk to you, because obviously processing a lot of this information and feelings is sometimes going through grief, right? So just, yes, there's other types of grief, but just sometimes going through the grief of, oh my goodness, I have this. Is there something wrong with me? What's going on? Or like you said, the parent side of things, is there something wrong with me? Did I do something wrong? And then, putting that on the child, not purposely, but just like you said, all the emotions that they're dealing with. So I want to talk about two types of grief. I want to talk about the grief within ADHD, just finding out as a child, I have this thing, I really don't know what it is. And then how do they work through that? And then just other grief in general, loss of something. One of the things I talk about in previous videos is just, moving from a new location to another location, because that's a lot on an ADHD child. Or losing a loved one, whether it be a grandmother or whatever it may be, just somebody close. So what are some of your thoughts and processes, and just in general, how do they deal with all these, all those emotions? How do you help your child work through grief? And then as parents who have ADHD children, how do you work through that grief on top of that?
Yeah. So I'm really glad that you brought up that grief is not always death related, because I think we often don't recognize that when there is a move, when there's a divorce, when, somebody is laid off or retires or has a significant illness or something like that. If somebody's incarcerated, those are all, forms of loss and change, like significant change to our life. And that elicits a grief response. We have that emotional response to that because there's a massive change that we need to adjust to. So when somebody dies or when there's this massive life transition, we have a pretty much the same response. And so when we're thinking of adults kind of helping a child through a grief process, I think just in general, it's important for adults to know that kids don't grieve the same way that adults do. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes if you're an adult who hasn't been around a child who's grieving, it actually can be a little bit alarming and somewhat disturbing to see the way that a child is grieving, because it really doesn't look like the way that we typically think of grief or the way that adults process. So Depending on their chronological or developmental age, kids might not even really understand what death is, or what a change is. So even if you've made a move, they might not understand that we live in a new place now, right? Like we don't have that home anymore. We live here now. So sometimes there's a cognitive process that has to kind of catch up and kick in. And a child actually doesn't really have the cognitive concept of the permanence of death until about age 8 or 9. So that's quite a few years before that. So if you have a child who's experiencing a loss before like age 8 or 9, they might not really understand. There's still like a temporariness to it. There's a lot of magical thinking that goes in, and that can be hard for adults. And sometimes it can be really frustrating. They might ask questions over and over. They might say, so-and-so's coming back, or like, we're just going to live in that other house again, or, we'll just make it the way that it was. They don't really understand, permanence yet. So that can be hard on adults. And a lot of times kids will go through emotion bursts when they're grieving. So they might be really upset for a couple of minutes, and then they're perfectly fine the next, like nothing ever happened. And so I think that's where it gets a little bit disturbing for an adult to see, because they don't quite understand, but that's a very normal way of a child expressing grief, that it's on or it's off. It's just part of it. I would say if you have an ADHD child who is experiencing a loss, either death related or not, what often happens is a lot of those ADHD symptoms get massively amplified. So you'll see the, emotional dysregulation kind of at a 10 sometimes. You'll see maybe more of the daydreaminess show up, or they're a little bit more disorganized or forgetful than normal. They just might be generally more sensitive. I just feel like everything kind of ramps up a little bit. And having worked with kids, who are grieving, kids who are ADHD and are both, it's very typical. I see it a lot. There's also issues with like sleeping and eating that might pop back up. They're not sleeping anymore, or they're afraid of the dark all of a sudden. You thought you worked through something and here it is again. So I would say that that's a pretty common thing for an ADHD kiddo to experience. It's just everything ramps up. And so I think as a parent or an adult who's working with a kid going through that, if you know that and you can anticipate that, I think that takes some of the surprise and the edge off of that. So even just knowing that ahead of time and keeping that in mind, that, okay, things are going to be a little bit more intense for a while. And so as long as I know that, I can respond, in the best way possible.
Yeah, it's very interesting, because I just remember, we've gone through several, unfortunately, in their young lives, different, grieving, supporting episodes, I can say. And I remember one of those times where my daughter just broke down and just cried. Right? It was just like, I consider her my empath. So she really soaks up that, that emotion. And she literally just broke down and cried. And she couldn't really connect the dots. Why she was so upset, because she happened to be, ironically, because I didn't think about that, younger than that 8, 9 years old, right? So or that age range. So I remember that. She just broke down, and I had a sense of why it was happening, but she didn't know. She just knew she was sad, and she just knew that she was missing something. And so, yeah, it is different. Even though, they were my only 2 children, so I don't know how other children react, but it was different for me. Yeah, so I can definitely see that. I could definitely see that. So as parents who are grieving, how do we make sure that obviously, just with anything, we wear our feelings and our emotions. We tend to do that on our faces, or, sometimes we react a certain way. So how do we make sure that we are in a state, still grieving ourselves, but in a state where it's not so overwhelming for the children? How do we make sure we're doing the right things?
Yeah, that's really, really hard. often if a child has experienced a loss, that means the adults in their life are also experiencing that loss. So yeah, having the parallel grief going on and the adult needing to be the support for the child, not the other way around. But that can be really tricky. And I recommend that people do what they can to have their own adult grief process. So whether that is what you do alone, what you do with your support network, a friend, a partner, whoever, that you are taking care of your own grief process and that you're connecting to it, so that you're not, trying to stuff things down and also support your child, because that's not going to work either. So going through your own process, but I also think modeling your process for a child is really, really big, because kids watch everything, right? They pick up on things that we have no idea we're even doing. And so it's important to also to show what a grief process looks like. So if you are sad, if you are, forgetful, if you are tired, if you're feeling okay, right? Just to show your child what grief can look like, and not to shy away from it, not to overindulge in it either, but to show what might be age appropriate for your child, and let them know that there are ups and downs in grief. It's perfectly normal to be kind of going on waves sometimes, and that we miss people, we miss the way a life used to be. There's also things that we do to move forward in that change. There's ways that we support each other, all of that. But to model, I think, is really good, so that kids do get a sense of what's involved in grieving, and so that they know for themselves kind of what to expect, and also what to do with it.
And do you suggest talking through it with them, especially if they're age appropriate, saying, for example, this is what mommy is going through, or just model it more physically?
I would say both, definitely. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So using age appropriate language. I really encourage people to be honest with your language too. So if it is a death, to talk with a child of, yes, that person died, that person is dead. We won't see them anymore. Be realistic with them, because what I've seen is when we use sort of euphemistic language, like somebody's gone to sleep, kids get afraid to go to sleep, because they don't have that ability to understand, again, that permanence or what that means. So if somebody went to sleep and I'm never going to see them again, as a child, I don't want to go to sleep anymore. Or what happens if mommy and daddy go to sleep? Or, so when we don't use, that language that fits with what we're talking about, it does set up a little bit of confusion and can create a little bit more anxiety. So yeah, talk it out with them, use that language, and also model for them like what sadness or whatever you're feeling looks like.
Okay. Very good. Very good. Okay. So now I wanted to move into therapy, right? So therapy tends to be a big word depending on who you're talking to.
Mm-hmm.
Some people are like, I am not going to therapy. There is no way you can get me to therapy. And then there's others who are like, yeah, my appointment's every Monday. It is at 12 o'clock and I'm going to be there every day or every time. So it's really interesting to really hear perspective. So just from your, just from your background, why are people, let's talk about the ones who are afraid to even go to therapy. Why do they fear therapy? And I also see it sometimes, it's a culture thing, or it's a, man versus woman thing, or, whatever it may be. But just in general, why are people afraid of therapy? Because, obviously we're talking about ADHD children, and the idea is to, if necessary, to bring your ADHD children or as a family to a therapist. But why are they even afraid to talk about or go to see a therapist?
Yeah, I think there's a couple reasons for hesitation around therapy. One is that there is kind of a longstanding stigma of, therapy is for when there's something seriously wrong and we don't really want to talk about it. And, so I think some of that is it's still around. I would also say that there's hesitation because oftentimes if you are seeking out help, that means there's a problem, right? And depending on the issue, that it actually takes a lot to admit that things aren't working, and that there is a problem, that there's something that needs this extra attention and work put into it. So sometimes it's just that of I'm not really ready to acknowledge that something is not working in my life and that I actually need to go get, some help for that. Um, and I think with both of those things, that the admission that there's a problem and also just the general stigma, there's a lot of embarrassment, there's shame, there's blame, there's vulnerability that goes along that's, tied into all of that. And that can just be a really, tough barrier at first for a lot of people. And, the other thing is too, that like, if you are, if you are ready to get in, and you're kind of thinking about this therapy thing, you still might not know what to expect. Like, I don't know how therapy works. I'm going to go talk to a stranger. I'm going to, like, how much work is involved. Just there's a lot of questions that come up, not knowing what to expect, and also not knowing how it's going to turn out, right? I don't even know if this is going to help. And so I'm going to do this big investment and put myself out there and not know how this is going to turn out. I think that's also something that worries people, and can be tough to get over and actually make a phone call to somebody. So
yeah, that makes perfect sense. So, from your professional opinion, especially when we're talking about ADHD children, and then we also mentioned autism children earlier, when is the right time? So when is the right time to take that step for a parent saying, we've got to get some help, as a family? What is your thought process?
I think with kiddos, if you're seeing behavioral things, or you're noticing that your child is interacting with the world differently, there might be delays, I would say get into therapy as early as you can. I encourage parents that even without a diagnosis, if you're seeing some of these issues, because behavior therapy can be so helpful, it doesn't matter if you have a label. We can look at what the issues are, and we can work on that stuff. We can do that parent training. So even if you're not ready to have your child assessed, evaluated, and get a diagnosis, that's okay, because if you're seeing things within your family and within your child, your relationship with your child, that just isn't what you want it to be, you can come in and get the ball rolling. You can start working on that stuff. And so, I think that, sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a second.
You're fine. You're fine.
Yeah, one of those things where you get a few things going in your brain. Yeah.
That's fine.
Yeah.
So, well, let me ask you this, because you brought up a really good point about, is this going to work, right? You're putting this investment in, and the reality is sometimes it doesn't, right? Sometimes you don't connect with the therapist, because there are people in the end, right? And you may not connect with them, or the particular path they have you go down just doesn't work for you. So what is your advice to people in terms of, for me, I look at it as, okay, I just find somebody else, right? But for those who are like, I give up, I mean, what is your advice to them in terms of that type of situation?
Yeah, and that is an issue that comes up, is that maybe it isn't a good fit with either the therapist style or the particular type of therapy, and it just doesn't work out. There might be other issues that honestly sometimes therapy just doesn't fit into the way that you have your life designed, and I get that. So You can prioritize or deprioritize the things that you want in your life, right? So sometimes it's just not a good time. So I always let people know too that you can go in and out of therapy as needed. That there isn't like I'm all in or I'm all out, right? So you can go in as things come up. You can go in as it fits your life. But I also encourage people when they start looking for therapists to avoid some of that of, well, it just didn't work out, so I'm not going to try again. If you're clear ahead of time on what the issues are, and what style might fit for you. Some people want a therapist who's very direct and is going to tell them, you got to do this, you got to, think about these things. I'm giving you homework every single time we see each other because I want you working on that throughout the week. Or somebody who's a little bit more laid back, just different kinds of things that, from a personality perspective, that kind of like, what's that style fit going to look like? But then also, what are the issues? Because not every therapist is equipped to handle everything. They're not trained in it. They're not comfortable with it. So knowing those two pieces, so what the issues are, and what a style fit would be for you ahead of time. So when you're calling therapists, when you're searching and stuff, you can preempt some of that potential discomfort and things not working out. You can kind of preempt that by knowing that ahead of time, just to settle into a good relationship in the beginning, rather than kind of getting into it and then realizing, oh, this isn't working. So I think kind of setting yourself up in a way that'll work for you ahead of time will help a lot of that.
Yeah, and that's a conversation that I have, in the past is, if it doesn't work, or the relationship where you think you can't help us, let us know ahead of time, right? Because I actually ran into that situation where a therapist, because of the situation, just couldn't help us, but was willing to recommend somebody that could. And I like that. And I like when there's that honest, conversation, and that helps me also make that decision quicker. Like you said, you're not investing time, emotion, because it's not just time, it's very emotional, right? I say if you do it right, right? I mean, because you're trying to put everything on the table because you want help and feedback. And so having that honest relationship up front and saying, hey, if you can't do this, please let me know. I think that's important. So going both ways, so I think that's important. So anything that we didn't cover, I mean, we covered a lot today. I mean, it's really interesting just to hear the difference between ADHD and autism. We talked about grief. We talked about therapy. Anything that I didn't cover any last minute thoughts for the parents that you would like to provide? Any topics that we did not mention?
I think one of the things, the only thing that's on my mind right now is, as far as, getting a diagnosis or just having a kid who doesn't have a diagnosis but has some things going on. For parents, find a good support network. Find other parents and other people who just get it, because you're already going to be dealing with a lot of stuff, and it'll be really, really helpful to just have somebody who knows what it's like when the house is a mess, when, maybe you're not as on time as you want to be, or something's kind of always coming up. Having other people in your life that just get that and understand and, won't think twice, that like, all right, that happens to us too, right? Like, so just really building that support network of people who just understand what life can be like. It can really go a long way. So whether you're in therapy or not, like, that support system is huge.
Very nice. And is there any, what I want to say, is there any resources that you might recommend, whether people, where there's any really good books for people to read, any of the topics that we covered, or if there's any online networks or YouTube videos or channels, what are some resources that you could recommend?
Yeah, well, I would recommend you as a great resource. um, but I'd also, like, there's two websites that I love. I always go to. Attitude Magazine is great,
Got it.
and understood.org. Those two, I feel like, have a huge wealth of information, and it's very practical, very easy to get into. So I love those two. As far as books, I love The Explosive Child by Ross Greene. He has a great perspective on kids who are sort of, well, as the title, explosive. So kind of just have those big emotions and things. I love his perspective on that. And pretty much anything by Dan Siegel. He has great perspectives on, how to maintain discipline and positive relationships with your kids. So yeah, so those are kind of.
Dan Siegel?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Dan Siegel. Okay. Okay. I'll make
Yeah.
sure to put that in the comments. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Very good.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
then for just to close it up, is there, if people had any more questions for you, I know you have your practices and, in certain areas or you can represent certain states, but just in general, if they have questions for you, how can they reach out to you?
You can find me. I have a website, adaptationscounseling.com. And my information's there. You can reach out through the website or by email. And if you want to follow me on Facebook or Instagram, I post things there every once in a while for different topics like grief and developmental things. So that would be at Adaptations Counseling.
Okay, adaptations counseling, perfect. Well, Meghan, thank you. Thank you so much. That was great. That was really good information. So I appreciate your time and thank you for coming on to the show and just sharing your knowledge with everyone.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was awesome.
So everyone, that is another episode of ADHD Love Parent Talk. Again, if you would like more episodes like this, please definitely do not forget to hit that subscribe button. And if you like the video, please like it so that, the YouTube algorithm will know that you like the video and will definitely show more videos like this. So thank you again for your time. All right, Meghan, have a great day.
Thanks.